Hi everybody, it's Matt Robinson. Welcome to another edition of the Writer's Block. As films like Oppenheimer have shown, and as unfortunately the world stage has shown, there's still a lot of interest in nuclear armament and nuclear secrets, and that's why we have a very interesting guest today. But let me give a little bit of your background. Her name is Galina Vromen, by the way, and after a career with Reuters, where she posted bylines from Israel, the Netherlands, England, and all over the place, as a journalist I'm jealous, she moved into nonprofit sector as a director at the Harold Grinspoon Foundation, where she launched and directed multicultural and multilingual reading readiness programs in Israel that gifted over 20 million books to young children and their families. Some of you around here may know PJ Library, which is also affiliated, similar type of program. And under her leadership, the programs were named the U.S. Library of Congress honorees for best practices in promoting literacy. Since her retirement from that world, she's focused on her lifelong dream of writing a novel. Her recently published debut, The Hill of Secrets, which we have here, tells the story of families living in Los Alamos, New Mexico during World War II, where the world's first atomic bomb was secretly built, and all the other secrets that were around that world. Her fiction has been performed on NPR's Selected Shorts and appeared in publications like American Way, Tikkun, and Reform Judaism, and we are honored to have her here today. That was quite a mouthful, but there's a lot to talk about. Welcome, Galina.
Thank you very much for having me.
So where did you first get an interest in writing, and why journalism as opposed to going for the novel right off the bat?
Well, I liked to write from the time I was a child. And really the journalism was motivated by two things. One is that I couldn't believe you could have a job where people paid you to ask questions. That seemed like incredible. And the other thing was that I hated getting up early in the morning, and I could not imagine being in the office at 9 o'clock in the morning. And at the time, before there was 24-hour media, you really could have a job at a newspaper. If it was a morning newspaper, you started working in the afternoon, and that just suited me absolutely fine. So those were the two things that really motivated me, and I love to travel, and I figured journalism was a great way to do that.
How did you pick your locations, or was that assignment based?
I wanted to spend time in Europe. So I took off for Paris, and I was lucky to land a job at the Herald Tribune, at the International Herald Tribune, and then I had to leave because I didn't get working papers, and so I took off to Israel, which is where I wanted to settle, and then I basically with Reuters, I joined Reuters, and I traveled with them to England and Holland. So those were the places that I basically worked from.
What are some of your most memorable stories?
In Paris, I think interviewing Rudolf Nureyev.
Wow.
He was in his 40s when I interviewed him, and I saw him perform in the evening, and then I was supposed to interview him the following morning at around 11. And I arrive at the apartment where he was staying, and he comes out of the bedroom, obviously just having gotten up enough to get to the interview at 11, and he could barely move. He had to lower himself into the chair. He was so stiff. And for me, I was just thinking, like, the price that he pays for his performance was just phenomenal. And in Israel, many years later, I think the immigration of the Ethiopians was a story that really, of Ethiopian Jews who were not accepted by the rabbinate, and they had an encampment for a number of weeks. And it was really impressive to see how clean it was and how well organized it was. They were an amazing, amazing group of people, and that, I think, left a really strong impression on me.
What prompted you to move into the literacy realm and promoting reading?
I fell into it. I mean, people always say you should have your passion and so forth, and in this case, I just lucked out. I worked for a foundation. They started PJ Library, the Harold Grinspoon Foundation. I was kind of on the founding team of that before it got its own executive director. And then I, at some point, told Mr. Grinspoon I wanted to go back to Israel. And he said, well, see if you can start like PJ Library in Israel. And I started it. I mean, basically launched it from nothing. I knew nothing about either children's literature or Jewish education or child development. I had no qualifications whatsoever, but I was basically it was being a good orchestra conductor. You hire the right people who know all that stuff, and you let them rip, and so that's how it really came about. But it was really quite by accident.
And well, the program was developed in Hebrew and in Arabic, so
That's
it was
correct. The
all-inclusive?
idea was basically that in America, PJ Library books go to the home. In Israel, I told Mr. Grinspoon that the post boxes were too small. You can't send a book home. You'd have to go to the post office to pick it up. And Israeli parents were not going to go to the post office to pick up a book every month that they didn't buy or order. So we worked with the Ministry of Education, and they became our partners. And so the books were delivered through schools. With primary education starting at the age of 3 in Israel, and we have the school system there is divided into state religious schools for Jews, state non-religious schools, secular schools, and Arab schools. So we basically, and then there's the ultra-Orthodox system, which is not entirely within the Ministry of Education, and we delivered to the first 3 and not to the 4th.
How did you navigate not only the political and social, but were they native written books, or were they translations, or both?
They were a combination.
Okay.
And with time also, there were more and more books written in Israel. When I got to Israel, it was very hard to find books with the idea of the PJ Library is to promote Jewish values and holidays. In Israel, it made absolutely no sense to focus on holidays because the Jewish holidays are the national holidays. So we focused much more on values or folk tales. And we really found that there were a lot of things that, there wasn't content. And so we would work with publishers because we were distributing a lot of books. I mean, we distributed 100,000 copies of a book. Publishers listened. And so we'd say, well, how come there isn't a story about, the famous story of the rabbi whose house is crowded, and he goes, the guy who complains to the rabbi that his house is crowded, and the rabbi says, bring in your chickens and bring in your cow, and then when he takes all the animals out, suddenly the house is empty and feels very roomy. And we thought that would be a great children's story. It didn't exist in Hebrew, and so that came about. Publishers eventually came up with a version we liked. And with the Arabic, some of the books are the same as the books in Hebrew, and some of the books were different, because what we focused on with Arabic was universal values. And guess what? Universal and Jewish values very often converge. So if you're doing a book on visiting the sick, you can use the same book.
So, I mean, were there questions of equity or balance between the populations?
That was really the whole point, was that we really wanted to assure that the Israel's Arab population, which is about 20% of the country, actually got the same book, got the same access to the books that the Hebrew-speaking part of the population did, and that was really what it was about. So the program was exactly the same in terms of how many books were distributed, how often they were distributed, and I would say the quality of the books. We really worked hard on having high-quality books.
Have you seen any ripple effects from your work in that field in terms of balancing how the different populations are treated in the country or in the region?
I don't know. I think for us, the idea that for me, the programs were a kind of microcosm of how I managed to live my dream of what I thought Israel could be. Religious kids and secular Jewish kids getting the same books were the only program in the country that did that. And with common ground, in other words, books that were acceptable more or less to everybody, and that Arabs were getting something that strengthened their Arab language skills and their heritage, but also that there was convergence and real equity. There were occasions when, like, for example, in Jaffa, which has a mixed Jewish Arab population, all the preschool teachers in Jaffa did an event together in public parks in Jaffa. And every school chose a book, and they did activities around the books, and the kids ran around from the Arab preschool projects to the Jewish ones, and it was an incredible thing of just, everybody mixing with everybody, and that was really wonderful. So there were occasions where that did happen.
Have you had interactions with the foundation upon coming when you're here, back in the States, does your time here influence your time there and vice versa? Because I know you live part of the year back and forth.
Well, basically my work was there.
Mm-hmm.
I think the influence has been that PJ Library now has a lot more books written by Israeli authors. Some of the books were translated from Hebrew. I think PJ Library has developed because you can't keep sending books on holidays all the time. You need to increase what you're sending books about. And so the Israeli authors provided a lot of that content.
So talking about books on vastly different topics, we now come to your novel, which really doesn't seem on the surface that it would have something to do with those other parts of your life, either the journalism or the literacy. What was the source of the idea, and what's the gestation?
There isn't that much of a link. I think not in terms of my actual activity and professional endeavors, I would say, but there is in the sense that my interest in nuclear weapons comes from an interest in the Middle East. I've been reading about nuclear proliferation and what the policies are, and Iran and Israel and Pakistan and all that for as long as I can remember myself. And so that is something that has always intrigued me. And then basically, I'm also very intrigued by the whole concept of secrets and how they impact us. What do you tell people? What don't you tell people? Why should you tell people things and why shouldn't you not tell people things? And so the convergence of those two to put a novel which is basically about personal secrets. Almost every character in the book has a secret that they don't want to reveal to anybody else. And to set that in the most secret place of the 21st century of the 20th century, was really something that just seemed like an incredibly appropriate background. And in addition, I had spent some time on kibbutz-like places in Israel, and the kind of patent placey things that people say or don't say about each other, and how everybody's in everybody's business. The more I learned about Los Alamos and domestic life there and everyday life there, the more it seemed like there were similarities. Obviously, Los Alamos was very different because you couldn't leave, and people didn't know why. The families didn't know why they were there. Obviously, the people working on the project did, but they weren't allowed to talk about it. So that's different. But the whole kind of people in each other's business has a similarity to any kind of communal living.
Well, I mean, it was very much a created community.
Absolutely. Right, it started, it had been a boys' school, and it was converted into this thing. There were basically initially a couple hundred people in 43, and by 1945 it was a community of 6,000 people. 2/3 of them were families. So.
What is the situation there now? Is there still a community? Is it just a research center?
There's tens of thousands of people that live in Los Alamos, at least. I don't know exactly, but I know that the population is increasing because the whole issue of I don't know whether it's called rejuvenating, but refurbishing America's nuclear arsenal is very much on the agenda of the defense industry or the defense policy of the United States right now. And so there is there has been since 2023 a real push to refresh the plutonium cores of the weapons. And I was just reading that there's like a $750 billion 10-year refurbishing project going on. Much of that will take place in Los Alamos.
What is it about the physical space now that still makes it relevant, that couldn't be done elsewhere?
Well, I think mostly that over the years they have the capacity and the laboratory equipment to do that kind of stuff and to produce the plutonium cores, and the experience. It's been a ongoing research base since the war. So.
Did you spend time
Yeah,
there?
I did. When I was writing the book, I went there for a week, and because I wanted to get, I needed the descriptions of,
Right.
I needed to know what it felt like to drive down to Santa Fe, and what was it like to arrive there, and all these kinds of things. So yeah, very much
Was
so.
there government clearance involved, or you just sort of
No,
went
no,
as
not at all.
as a journalist observer?
I took an Airbnb, there's Airbnb, if you want to have stayed in Airbnb at Los Alamos, it's not a problem.
Wow. So what was the process of writing the book? Like, when did you decide this is the time? And it was
Well,
quite a long.
It was very long. I started researching it maybe 20 years ago.
Mhm.
And then I was working a lot, and I would write only on weekends. And then I stopped for a while. And then I went and did an MFA at Bar-Ilan University. So this was part of my project. But the problem was that the week after the first class we had after I signed up for this program was they said, "Oh, you can't submit chapters of a book as part of the program. You have to submit short stories." And I had said I want to write a novel. So I almost left the program. But instead I did write short stories based on the characters, so I got to know my characters, but it was a stupid way of writing a book. Only one of the chapters that had to do with any of the has remained in the book. Everything else got chucked out. But it was a way for me to learn to know my characters. So in that sense, but that's part of the reason it took forever to write, because I didn't work on the structure until very late. It just sort of had descriptions and relationships, and the sequencing of the plot came way too late in the process to be efficient.
How did you come up with who has what secret and how they were going to interplay?
It took me a while to figure it out. Like, what was a credible secret for somebody to have? I mean, I knew I wanted, like romance and illicit romance, and that was clear. But sort of what everybody's secret was took a little longer.
Now, on your website, which is your name, yes,
Yes.
GalinaVromen.com, you suggest questions for book clubs, which is always appreciated. But in addition to the plot points, you kind of encourage people to investigate the idea of secrets and of history and of who knows what when. What sort of feedback have any of your readers reached out to you with like interesting stories that might have come up from their own lives?
No, I don't think people write to the author about their own secrets, but I think that I think we live I myself have gone from an age where people didn't talk about things. They didn't talk about cancer. They didn't talk about, if somebody was a homosexual, was gay in the family, you didn't talk about it. So things have changed a lot in terms of secrecy. And to my mind, I guess I'm very old-fashioned, but maybe a little bit too much. Like, I'm not sure this, all these things that you can find out about half siblings you didn't know existed,
Right.
Whether that's such a great thing, and whether sometimes it, so for me the whole issue of where do you draw the line and why is something that I'd like to leave readers with thinking about what is to be more, I would say, thoughtful about their own secrets. And in terms of national secrets, I mean, I think the discrepancy between how the world's first atomic bomb, which really changed the world in a very profound way, was created in complete secrecy. And you compare that with what happened with civilian use of nuclear power, which was, riots and community involvement and all this and there's a huge discrepancy. And we're, again, on the brink of a lot of things happening in the nuclear armament industry in our country, and I don't know how awake people are to it, that we really are probably in the most dangerous period in terms of nuclear, of the use of nuclear weapons since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I think people need to be on their toes.
You also encourage people to ask about the responsibility that the scientific and development industry has.
Absolutely. Well, that I think is also, it is touched on the book, how the scientists felt about the use of the bomb, and there were very, very different responses among the scientists. People who saw the Oppenheimer movie got a sense of that, and I think, especially with the whole discussion about AI today, I was listening to an interesting podcast excerpt from Dan Ariely, who's I don't know, economic psychologist, I think, who sort of said, look, if you think about cars, and you look about the development of cars in the past 20 years, much of it has been focused on safety. Safety belts, car seats for children, the car that prevents you from knocking into the next guy. All these things have been oriented that way. He said, but when you look at social media and AI, it is not oriented towards being safer for us. And that's only going to come if it's pressure to do that, if people really, and we're not at that stage because AI monetizes or social media monetizes its lack of safety. But the question is, where is the responsibility of people who are involved in these industries to make them safer for use?
How do you feel that your background, your training, your proclivity as a journalist impacted the style of the writing? Because it does obviously have historical elements underneath the personal story.
Well, I very much wanted to make it as historically accurate as I could. It really, but the joy of being a fiction writer is that you can get away with stuff like when you're a journalist, you have to verify, right? You have to
in theory, yes.
Well, you do. I mean, I had to get confirmation from 2 sources if I got something, and in fiction, you can kind of conjecture. And sometimes it turns out that you were right, even though you didn't have the facts. For example, there's a mention of a potter, a Native American potter in the book, and one of her pots is in Oppenheimer. She's very famous, Maria Martinez. One of her pots is in Oppenheimer's house in the book, and I had no idea whether Oppenheimer actually owned a pot of hers. And then when I was looking at oral histories, reading oral histories of people from Los Alamos, there's a very big archive. There was a maid who had worked in Oppenheimer's house and said she liked to go to their house because she always saw her aunt's pots in his house. And it was like, bingo, But that's like the difference between a novelist. Bingo, it's like, okay, I made it up, but it's true. And a novelist, well, journalist obviously can't do that.
Yeah, I'm glad that you still hold out hope that you can't do that. Yeah. So with all the different ways that you've been involved in writing and literacy and literature, what is next? I mean, you had this goal for a long time. You've seen it through. It's a wonderful book. So what's the next mountain to climb?
Well, I might do a sequel. I'm thinking about it, but
with
I'm not quite there.
The other stories
with one of the characters, like what happens next to her. But I haven't decided yet, and I'm thinking maybe I want to do a biography. It's such a plunging into cold waters to start a novel, and I'm determined not to do it as stupidly as I did the first one, and to really figure out what the plot is and figure out what the twists in the plot are and where I'm going and have a really extensive outline. So I'm playing with it right now, but I don't know.
Are there any other forms of writing that you'd like to explore?
Biographies fascinate me.
How would you choose the subject?
I have a couple in mind that I've sort of gotten interested in. Obviously, the first thing you do is try to figure out how many other biographies there are of somebody. And why somebody would want to read the biography of a particular person. But yeah, biographies definitely interest me. That might be the other direction.
Is that something that you were, a fan of as a reader? Are there
I love biographies. When I'm in the States, I live not far from Yo-Yo Ma, and I guess I have a fantasy that I would love to write his memoirs.
Wow.
Or let me ghostwrite. I'm sure he could write it himself.
I got to meet him a couple years ago, and he actually shakes hands, which I was mystified by.
I actually interviewed him many, many years ago when I was working in the Netherlands, and now live close enough that it would be very convenient. But it's only in my mind. So
drop a little note by on your way into town, things like that.
I might go for it, but I don't think he will.
I'll see if I can find his phone number somewhere from it. But anyway, the book is really terrific. Frankly, it had been something that I didn't know too much about, and the human element was, the personal was a really great entry point. So thank you for that. Definitely, I would say worth the effort. I'm sure our fans will enjoy it. And thank you again for being on time. And thank you for joining us on the Writer's Block.